Welcome to my channel, The Untamed Soul. The mountain air smelled like the end of the world, heavy with static electricity and rising wind. Ethan was miles deep in the Bitterroot wilderness, desperate to clear the ridgeline before the storm truly broke. His 6-horse team, usually steady, were balking, sensing the danger in the air. "Come on, boys!" Ethan yelled, urging the lead mare forward. That's when the sky ripped open. A bolt of lightning, thicker than a redwood, struck nearby. The sound wave hit Ethan like a physical blow, and the light was absolute zero, white, blinding, and final. He was thrown from the wagon seat, his head slamming into the muddy ground. When Ethan opened his eyes, the world was gone. It wasn't dark. It was a searing, painful white nothingness, as if the sun had exploded inside his skull. He was deafened by the ringing, lost, and knew with a gut-deep terror that the lightning had stolen his sight. The tearing roar of the wood and the terrified screams of his horses were distant and garbled. He scrambled on his knees, hands searching the slick mud. Panic, cold and sharp, clawed at his throat. You can't see. You can't move. His men were gone. The wagon was overturned. Ethan was completely alone, blind in a blinding rainstorm, with night falling fast. Then he heard a sound close by, not a gallop of fear, but a soft, hesitant shuffle. He reached out, and his fingers brushed against coarse, rain-matted mane. It wasn't the lead mare, or any of the strong draft horses. It was the 7th horse. It was Ghost. Ghost was a magnificent iron-gray stallion. But 2 years prior, an undiagnosed eye infection had left him totally and permanently blind. Ethan kept him out of mercy, locking him in the back pasture, convinced he was a useless liability. Now, ironically, this broken animal was his only hope. Ethan clutched the horse's mane, his chest heaving. "Ghost," he whispered, the name a ragged admission of despair. "They're all gone. It's just us, isn't it?" The horse stood perfectly still, his massive, sightless head tilting toward the sound of Ethan's voice. In the darkness of the storm, one blind man and one blind horse had found each other, stranded in a wilderness that promised only death. The storm intensified, shifting from rain to biting sleet. Ethan felt the desperate need to move, but every instinct screamed at him to freeze. Moving meant stepping off a cliff, walking into a tree, or wandering in endless circles. The world, once ordered by sight, was now a cruel, chaotic labyrinth. He kept his hand locked in Ghost's wet, cold mane, pulling himself slowly to his feet. He was dizzy, the constant ringing in his head a counterpoint to his pounding fear. He lost control again. A voice in his mind sneered. It was the same voice that haunted him since the accident last year, the one where his own momentary lapse had cost his family so much. He had always prided himself on control, on foresight, on seeing the danger coming. Now he couldn't see anything. He felt utterly broken. He tried to lead Ghost, pulling gently on the bridle, directing him east toward home. Ghost resisted, pulling back just enough to anchor Ethan. "No, Ghost, we need to go this way," Ethan pleaded, his voice cracking. Ghost snorted, a deep, rumbling sound of refusal, and shifted his weight. Ethan felt the immense animal gently, stubbornly, pull him back, nudging him slightly to the north. Ethan's sense of direction was based on a 10-second flash of memory before the blinding light. Ghost's direction was based on instinct honed in total darkness for 2 years. For a long, paralyzing moment, Ethan fought the urge to dominate, to enforce his will. But he couldn't even see the horse's eyes to command him. He had to surrender. He had to trade his broken knowledge for the horse's perfect ignorance. "Okay, boy," Ethan gasped, releasing the bridle and grasping the mane again. "You lead. I'm yours." The moment Ethan yielded, Ghost moved. It wasn't a confident stride, but a slow, methodical lift and placement of each huge hoof. It was a blind man feeling with his cane, magnified 1,000 times. Ethan could feel the texture of the ground through Ghost's movements. Solid rock, then spongy moss, then slippery shale. Ghost was mapping the unseen terrain with his ears and nose. His head swung low, sniffing the air currents, filtering the scent of pine and water and fear. They moved for an hour through the absolute dark. Ethan's heart pounded, counting every step, every minute that put him further from the main trail. Then Ghost stopped dead. Ethan stumbled into the horse's shoulder, his pulse spiking. "What is it? What's wrong?" He heard the noise before he felt the drop. The steady roar of a mountain river, heavy with storm runoff, was thundering somewhere just ahead. Ghost's ears, impossibly sharp, had registered the sound before Ethan's shock-deafened senses could. Ethan reached out, and his hand fell over empty space. A sheer drop. If he had taken 2 more steps following his own blind momentum, they would have plunged into the raging torrent below. Ghost hadn't just stopped him. He had saved him. Ethan slumped against the warm flank of the horse, a wave of sickening gratitude washing over him. The horse who was supposed to be useless, the one he had retired and forgotten, had just proved his sight was infinitely better than Ethan's own. The only way forward was total dependence on a creature Ethan had dismissed as broken. The river was a major setback, an emotional speed bump Ethan couldn't afford. In his mind, the shortest route home was now blocked. He wanted to rage, to curse the lightning and the storm, but he knew he had to save his energy for movement. Ghost, however, did not panic. Ethan felt the horse turn slowly, moving parallel to the abyss, searching. Ghost wasn't looking for a safe crossing. He was looking for a way around. Ethan closed his eyes, leaning his cheek against the horse's neck, trying to borrow the animal's heightened senses. He began to smell things Ethan hadn't noticed before. The sharp tang of wild mint growing near damp earth, the musky scent of deer that had crossed recently, and a faint, coppery smell of exposed mineral ore. Ghost was reading the landscape like a map written in scent. The bond evolved from dependence to communication. Ethan started guiding Ghost not by pulling the reins, but by shifting his weight, placing his hand higher or lower on the horse's neck. If he pressed lightly behind the horse's ear, Ghost knew to tilt his head, listening for a change in the air currents. If Ethan leaned into the shoulder, Ghost knew to slow the methodical pace. They followed the raging river upstream for what felt like hours. Climbing higher, the air growing colder and thinner. The rhythmic crunch of Ghost's hooves on gravel became Ethan's only anchor. "We need shelter, boy," Ethan whispered, his throat raw. "Just a little break." Just as he spoke, Ghost stopped again, his body tense, his head lifting high. Ethan felt the muscles in Ghost's neck tighten. The breath held deep. This was not a physical obstacle. This was danger. Ethan strained his ears past the endless ringing. He heard nothing but the storm. But Ghost had heard something else entirely. A low, guttural warning rumble began in the horse's chest, vibrating through Ethan's entire body. Then, from the darkness just ahead, came a sharp, wet snap of a twig. Something large, quiet, and hungry was watching them. A wolf. Maybe 2. Ethan fumbled for the knife, strapped to his belt. Useless. He was blind and standing next to a horse that couldn't see the threat closing in. His panic returned, cold and fast, worse than before. Ghost, sensing the man's sudden, debilitating fear, didn't run. Instead, he made a decision. He took a single, powerful step to the side, positioning his massive body perfectly between Ethan and the direction of the sound. He lowered his head, not in submission, but in preparation. He let out a piercing, challenging scream. Not a whinny of fear, but the roar of a stallion defending his territory. The sound was primal, shocking, and huge. It sliced through the noise of the storm. Silence followed. The wolves hesitated. Ghost held his ground, his muscles coiled, ready to fight blind. Ethan felt the raw, protective courage radiating off the animal and realized something profound. Ghost wasn't useless. He had simply learned to use his whole body, his whole spirit, as a weapon and a guide. He didn't need eyes to be a protector. The silence held for a tense minute, and then Ethan heard the faint sound of paws retreating into the brush. Ghost had won the encounter with pure, overwhelming defiance. When the danger passed, Ghost let out a long, shuddering breath. Then, without fanfare, he gently nudged Ethan with his muzzle, as if to say, "Don't worry, I'm here." They found a small, overhanging rock lip, a shallow cave, smelled out by Ghost. They moved into the relative dryness. Ethan's exhaustion hit him like a physical illness. He collapsed against a rock, shivering uncontrollably. The storm outside raged on, but inside the cave, the noises were muffled, turning the world into a tight, dark cocoon. Ethan pulled the thin saddle blanket off Ghost's back, wrapping it around his own shoulders. It smelled strongly of horse, hay, and hard work, a comforting, familiar scent in this strange, sightless world. The long night brought the deep despair Ethan had been fighting. He was hungry, cold, and utterly lost. More than the physical danger, the guilt returned, suffocating him. He remembered the day Ghost went blind, a seemingly minor scrape turning septic, a few crucial hours lost when Ethan prioritized an urgent delivery over treating a horse's eye. He had dismissed Ghost's pain, and Ghost paid for it with his sight. Now, Ethan had paid for his own arrogance with his sight. "I always think I know best. I always think I have control." He ran his hand over Ghost's strong shoulder, tracing the curve of the bone. Ghost let out a deep, contented sigh and rested his head heavily on Ethan's thigh. It was a gesture of trust, so complete it brought tears to Ethan's useless eyes. "I'm sorry, boy," Ethan whispered into the darkness. "I'm sorry I let you get hurt. I'm sorry I abandoned you in the backfield because you weren't perfect anymore." He spoke for a long time, the words pouring out, about the guilt, the fear of losing his ranch, the shame of not being able to provide for his family after the previous year's losses. He was confessing to the one being who couldn't judge him, who could only feel him. He felt Ghost shift his weight, then nudge his cheek gently, repeatedly, with his muzzle. It wasn't pity. It was a steady, warm presence. It was a promise. You are not alone in the dark. In that moment, the bond sealed. They were two broken creatures, tethered by shared darkness. Ethan realized that Ghost didn't pity his blindness. He understood it. Ghost had mastered this world of absence, and now he was teaching Ethan how to live in it. Ethan finally drifted into a deep, heavy sleep. Not alone, but guarded by the silent, powerful presence of the animal whose life he had once neglected. He slept because Ghost was listening to the darkness for both of them. The cold dawn brought fragile hope. The rain had slowed to a drizzle. Ethan woke to the dry heat of Ghost's breath on his face. He felt slightly steadier, but his vision remained a blank white canvas of pain. "Time to move, partner," Ethan murmured, his voice rusty. Ghost responded instantly, standing up and shaking his massive frame. They left a meager shelter, now guided by a new sense of urgency. Ethan was weak, but now he wasn't just walking away from danger. He was walking toward purpose. Ghost's confidence had infected him. Ghost moved with renewed purpose, now following a game trail that was subtly softer underfoot, a route Ethan wouldn't have dared take if he could see. But the danger wasn't over. As they crossed a rocky clearing, Ethan heard a sound that chilled him more than the howl of the wolf, the distant whinny of a strange horse. This wasn't a wild horse. It was a working mount, and the sound of it was moving in their direction. Other riders, hunters, maybe search parties, but the sound was too methodical, too deliberate. The wilderness was home to poachers and rival ranchers who wouldn't hesitate to take a good horse or man supplies, or worse. Ethan pressed his cheek against Ghost's neck. "Someone's coming fast. We have to be silent, boy. We have to disappear." Ghost understood the shift. He tensed, and his steady, rhythmic walk instantly changed into a liquid-smooth, silent trot. He dropped his head lower, minimizing his profile, and veered sharply off the trail, plunging into a dense thicket of spruce. The spruce needle snagged at Ethan's jacket, whipping his face, but he didn't dare let go. Ghost was navigating spaces that seemed impossible, weaving between trunks with precision Ethan knew he couldn't have managed even with sight. It was terrifying and exhilarating. A blind horse running full speed through a forest. Ethan focused entirely on listening. He heard the riders shout, their voices muffled by the trees, but clearly closer now. They were following the trail they had just abandoned. Faster, Ghost, they're right there. Ethan whispered, trying to push the horse without reins. Ghost answered with a surge of power, but the ground beneath them began to change. It became soft, boggy. They were sinking into a swampy section. The pursuers' voices grew louder directly on their flank. Ethan realized they were trapped. If Ghost sank, they were done. In a moment of intense clarity, Ethan did the only thing he could. He used his ears, listening to the location of the riders, and used his hands, pressing the signal for turn and jump high onto Ghost's neck. Hard left, boy. Go for the rocks. Ghost trusted the command instantly. He pivoted his massive frame, digging his hooves out of sucking mud, and lunged. Ethan felt the horse gather all his power and leap, not over an obstacle, but out of the mud and onto a tiny, unseen ridge of granite. The moment Ghost landed, the ground beneath the horse's back hooves gave way with a wet, sloppy sound. A loud curse split the air. Close by, one of the riders had spotted them. There, the gray one. Blind as a bat, but he's fast. Get him. They were committed. Ethan knew they had to keep moving, no matter the cost, because a working horse like Ghost, once captured, would be worked to death or sold off, never to roam free again. He was no longer just guiding Ethan home. He was fighting for his own freedom and sense of purpose. The final obstacle loomed, the Great Canyon River. It was the last boundary, a massive, glacial melt-off that divided the brutal wilderness from Ethan's familiar grazing lands. It was wider, faster, and colder than the tributary they had bypassed hours ago. Ethan knew the sound well, the hungry, crushing roar of water. Ghost hesitated on the bank, the spray dampening his muzzle. This was the most dangerous moment. The current could sweep them under. The ice-cold water could seize their muscles. Behind them, the sounds of their pursuers were no longer distant. Two horsemen, persistent and hard, were closing in, their voices distinct now, echoing to the canyon gorge. It's now or never, Ethan gritted out. He knew his men would have abandoned the crossing here. He knew a sighted man would stop and search for a boat or a bridge. But they had no time. They had to cross here. Ethan tightened his grip on the mane, leaned forward, and let out a command he hadn't used in years, a sound used to push a working animal past exhaustion. Go, Ghost! Hard! Home! Ghost exploded into the water. The cold was shocking, instantly stealing Ethan's breath. The current immediately tried to rip them downstream. Ghost fought with every ounce of his massive strength, his body angled against the flow, the water churning around his legs. Ethan felt himself becoming disoriented, the sound of the river overwhelming the ringing in his head. He clung to Ghost, terrified he would slip. He knew the moment Ghost lost footing, they would both be dragged down. Suddenly, Ghost faltered. A large, unseen log, heavy with water, smashed into his left flank, throwing him off balance. Ghost whinnied in pain and slipped, his head momentarily dipping under the surface. At that exact moment, the two riders burst onto bank, yelling in triumph. There they are. Take the horse. Ethan knew Ghost was exhausted, battered, and blinded. He couldn't fight the river and the man. He made a desperate decision, the ultimate exchange of faith. Ethan shoved himself backward, off the horse's back, letting go of the mane. The water instantly seized him, dragging him under. Ghost felt the loss of weight, the sudden absence of the human he was protecting. He whinnied again, thrashing, trying to turn back toward the sound of the splash. But Ethan didn't let him. Struggling against the current, choking on icy water, Ethan used his voice, aiming it toward the far bank where Ghost should be swimming. Go, Ghost, go. Not here. Home. The human voice was shrill with command and absolute surrender. Ghost, hearing the specific direction, made the choice. He didn't turn back for the man he couldn't see. He turned for the goal Ethan had set. He dug his hose deep into the silt, pushed off the river bottom one last time, and swam with the terrifying, blind commitment of a creature who had found his sole purpose. He swam hard, leaving the struggling, choking rancher behind. The men on the bank saw the blind horse make the crossing, but they watched the man get swept away. They assumed Ethan was lost, and they had no way to cross the raging river to claim the horse. They stood, defeated, watching the gray stallion heave himself onto the far bank, dripping and exhausted, but safe. Ethan, however, had used the current as a shield. Swept far downstream, he managed to grab hold of a low-hanging willow branch, pulling himself onto a narrow gravel bar. Minutes later, he lay there, hyperventilating, freezing but alive. He was alone again, but Ghost was safe. The sacrifice had worked. It took Ethan another hour to drag himself up the steep embankment of the river gorge. He was running on pure adrenaline and the echo of the horse's commitment. His body was numb, his eyes still searing white. He called out a soft, weak sound. "Ghost, are you there?" Silence. Despair, colder than the river water, began to creep back in. He had survived the crossing, but had he lost his guide, his partner, his only link to home? He slumped against a cold, mossy boulder. He closed his sightless eyes and tried to remember the scent of the mint, the feel of Ghost's muscles, the sound of the wolf's retreat. He tried to project his hope, his need, into the empty air. "Please, boy, just one more sign." And then he heard it. Not a whinny, not a whimper, but a sound he hadn't heard since he left the ranch. The soft, rhythmic snort of a horse grazing. It was the sound of calm of arrival, and it was close. Ethan stumbled forward, crawling, then walking toward the sound. The ground was smoother here, softer. He smelled the unmistakable odor of cut hay and pine shavings, and a scent Ethan knew better than his own name, home. He walked another few agonizing steps, and his knees buckled. He fell onto soft, dry earth, and a moment later, he felt a warm, wet muzzle nudge his collarbone. "Ghost!" Ethan breathed, tears finally mixing with the cold rain on his face. Ghost had done it. He had not only survived the crossing, but he had found the final, complex turn onto the barely visible perimeter trail that led straight to the main pasture gates of Ethan's ranch. Just then, a wave of noise crashed over Ethan. The frantic barking of his dogs, the worried shouts of his men, who had made a home earlier and were now organizing a larger search. "Mr. Ethan, oh my God, it's him." Hands, warm and firm, grabbed him, pulling him up. His brother, George, was crying, his voice thick with relief. Ethan was enveloped in the chaotic, noisy warmth of rescue. But Ethan only had eyes for the horse he couldn't see. He reached out, found Ghost's neck, and pulled the horse's massive head down to his chest, hugging the animal hard. "Thank you, partner," he whispered. "You show me the way." George noticed the horse. That's Ghost. How in the name of God did he find you? He's blind. And how did you even make it across the river? The current is deadly right now." No one could explain how. They asked Ethan 1,000 questions about the lightning, the crossing, the threat. Ethan told them the actions, but he kept the truth of the journey, the psychological, soul-deep journey, to himself. He knew the truth was not in sights or sounds, but in a bond forged in mutual darkness. Later, the ranch doctor confirmed the blinding flash was temporary, a severe but ultimately temporary retinal burn. Ethan would recover his sight, but it would take weeks of rest in the dark. In those weeks, Ethan sat in the quiet dark of his bedroom, feeling the guilt and fear finally recede. He wasn't afraid of the dark anymore. He had learned to trust the senses beyond sight, and he had learned that brokenness was not uselessness. On the day the doctor removed the final bandages, the first thing Ethan looked for was Ghost. He found him in the largest, sunniest pasture, grazing peacefully. Ghost looked up, not with sight, but with recognition, turning his head instantly toward the sound of Ethan's footsteps. Ethan walked over, his vision still blurry, but his purpose clear. He wrapped his arms around the horse's neck, no longer relying on her guidance, but connected forever by shared purpose. Ghost, once the symbol of Ethan's failure to protect and his guilt over a costly mistake, was now the source of his healing. He had taught Ethan that even when you lose control, and even when the world goes white, instinct and trust can lead you home. Ethan stood there, his sight slowly returning, looking at the horse who couldn't see him, and knew they were both finally whole. The rancher had brought Ghost home, but the blind horse had given the rancher back his life.